there's a lot of surplus, a lot of structural change also that's taking place within agriculture. I mean, for example, in most people's minds, agriculture is associated with food grains. Certainly from where I come, northern India, Punjab, Haryana, they all think of agriculture as food grains. But you know, actually the importance of food grains in agriculture is declining. I mean, the value of food grain output as a share of total agricultural output is falling, and what is increasing is the value of milk and dairying generally, and poultry and horticulture. So you need to think of agriculture also going through a structural change. What is the implication of that? I think the implication, the moment you think of it as structural change, you realize that the name of the game is not repeating the same old things that we used to talk about earlier. I mean, for example, when food grain production was the big thing, what succeeded then was publicly funded research, which of course gave the high-yielding crops, and a minimum support price, which gave the farmer an assurance that you can take your grain to the mandi and there will be a price. Now, you know, this is not at all workable when agriculture diversifies into perishable horticultural crops. You can't just sort of harvest the crop and then sort of take it to the mandi in whatever way you like. If it's a perishable crop, it needs to be moved quickly and preferably in a refrigerated manner or in a cooled manner, and so on. And secondly, it's quite useless having the concept of minimum support price, because, you know, there are tomatoes that look nice, there are tomatoes that don't look nice. Each one of them will get a different price. So the whole pricing of the marketing of perishable crops requires a completely different market structure, not what you have for rice and for food grains. So that's another example of structural change. And what that brings in is the role of the private sector. You know, the idea that the public sector will buy vegetables and so on, and it just doesn't make any sense at all. And we have not yet faced up to that fact. Central government for several years has been saying, the present government has also been saying that, you know, we should just get rid of the Agricultural Produce Marketing Committee Acts, which create a monopoly in the sense that the only place where you can buy produce is in the mandi. And in the mandi, the only people who trade are licensed traders. And that's a sort of a closed network with very non-transparent ways of determining prices. So farmers just give their produce to an agent who takes it to the mandi. And then the produce is sold in a non-transparent way. And he doesn't really know what's the price. And the guy says, look, that morning, this was the price for potatoes, and that's it. So there's a huge amount of exploitation, and every one of you have heard that farmers get a fraction of what the consumers pay. So if you look at what is the price of tomatoes in a retail market and you look at the price that the farmer gets, the difference is huge. Now, how do you overcome that? Not, in my view, by the state government getting into the act the way they do with food grains, but really by having a much more modern system of marketing of perishable crops. Along with that will come logistics and cold chains and warehouses, etc., etc., etc. So here's the structural change. If we know that the structure has changed, then we can work out a way of addressing that problem. You know, at the moment there's a lot of talk, for example, of e-marketing. Very good idea. But you know, an e-market doesn't actually serve much purpose unless it's associated with reliable grading. I mean, the theory of an e-market is that if I'm sitting in Delhi and I want to buy something from an e-market in Guwahati, I should be able to look at it and see what the price of different vegetables is and buy them. But that only makes sense if there's good grading if after I bought it, it won't deteriorate in transport, if there are logistics companies where I can sort of tell people that, look, I'm buying this from here, you please pick it up, bindi of a particular grade and bring it over, and within 1 day or 2 days it turns up where I want it to turn up. That requires a whole new ecosystem, and we need to develop that ecosystem if you're going to be able to move, if you're going to accommodate the structural change that's taking place in agriculture. So in the same way, I think some of the other structural changes that we have to look at, I made a list of things that I want to talk about. I don't want to spend too much time on it, so I'll talk about briefly, and I don't know if there is room or time for questions. We can have a few questions also. But let me give you, for example, six points that I want to touch upon. The first point relates to urbanization, which I mentioned. The second point relates to education and skills, which I think I've also mentioned. The third point relates to technology and employment and what it's going to do. The fourth point relates to the role of small and medium industries. The fifth point relates to financial inclusion and technology change and what that is doing. And finally, I want to say a few words on climate change and how that might impact us. So, going back to this list, the idea in each case is that these are things that they all need to be approached in a framework in which we recognize that the structure is changing. And then we have to work out a way of doing what is necessary to facilitate this structural change. And the particular things you have to do will vary. Now first, urbanization. You know, India historically has been slow to urbanize. And many of our political leaders in the past didn't think much of urbanization. I mean, they used to feel that really India lives in the villages and that's what it should be, and preserve the rural way of life, etc. But of course, you know, that was legitimate and credible when we were a low-income country, very limited economic development and so on. I mean, every country as it has developed have urbanized. Today in India, about 31% of our population lives in urban areas. If we think of becoming twice and 4 times the present per capita income level, and we compare what's happening in other countries, we need to allow for something on the order of 55%, if not more, of the population becoming urban, and that could happen in 20 years' time. Now, you know, that is a huge, really huge structural change. And 2 things follow from that. One, this shift is not going to mean an expansion of the existing metro cities. They are already too large. I mean, if you go anywhere in the world and say that, you know, Mumbai is 19 million, Delhi is 19 million, those are big. Those are the size of countries in the United Nations. So it is quite clear that if we are going to have a process of urbanization, that process of urbanization is going to be a big expansion in what are today called the non-metro towns, which would be either the large cities or even the second-tier cities. Now, you know, very little thinking has gone into what is the scope for improving urban services in these smaller towns. The present position is that we are not even able to achieve improvements in urban services in the metro towns. So how much thinking are we doing? Will we be able to have these smaller towns, second-level cities, grow and absorb people with the right amount of economic services? You know, a critical thing here is that city development, this is true all over the world, city development cannot take place through a top-down system where the state government provides the money for the cities. That never happens. State governments at the most bother about the state capital. So it's kind of generally regarded everywhere that we need to empower the cities. And I think we've not done that. The Constitution, actually, the 73rd and 74th Amendment did say that we must empower the Panchayati Raj, the lower level bodies. But in reality, nothing has happened. So we need a bit of thinking on how are we going to ensure that our cities have the power, city governments have the power to actually organize themselves in a way in which they can become economically competitive, providing the kind of services you need if you're going to have a competitive economy. You know, I would go back to when I was in the late 1980s. I was part of the delegation that Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi led on his visit to China in late 88. And I was quite struck by the fact that when we first arrived in Shanghai, the program said that the Prime Minister will be given a dinner by the mayor of Shanghai. Now, you know, in India, protocol-wise, mayors do not figure high enough to do that. So I said, well, how come we're doing this? Then I was told that, you know, Shanghai is like a province, it's not just a city. And in any case, the person that they were, who was going to host the Prime Minister was most likely to become the Prime Minister himself 10 years later, which he did. Now, you know, in China, political leaders are trained by making them mayors of important cities and then seeing how they perform. That doesn't happen here. No important leader in India wants to become head of a city, nor does the state government organize itself in that manner. So I think this is a big question. Do we think that we will be able to have cities that deliver good governance without a very fundamental change in how the cities work within the governance structure of the country, including devolution and having the ability to tax, etc., etc. And I think this is a very critical thing. Most people abroad, when they look at Indian cities, will tell you that our cities simply do not have the power to do what is needed in order to make it a good city. All the powers are with the state government and very little is actually delegated down. So that has to change. Now, underlying that is a completely different area, and that is the area of electoral representation, because we've frozen the representation at whatever 1971 population level at one point, and then we changed it. The percentages of urban seats, or rather the number or the percent of seats in the Lok Sabha that represent urban constituencies is much less than the actual urban population. So the cities don't have the same amount of vote in the national parliament, and I'm sure that in the state legislatures that's also true. So those are examples of the structural change which are related to the problem of urbanization.